let's talk about lipids. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the term, you might associate it with things like fat molecules, and that would not be incorrect. Fat molecules are a very common form of lipid. In fact, this is an example of a fat molecule, or a triglyceride right over here. Fat or triglyceride molecule right over here, and this one in particular is a polyunsaturated triglyceride, and we go into a lot of depth on this on the video on the molecular structure of fats / triglycerides, or on saturated and unsaturated fats. But you see the telltale signs. You see a glycerol backbone right over here, and 3 fatty acids, or what were 3 fatty acids, attached to what was a glycerol molecule. We go into a lot of depth on that, but fats are not the only type of lipids. And so what makes all of these other things that I'm about to show you also lipids? What commonality do they have with fats? Well, lipids are just the general term for a whole class of molecules that tend to not be so soluble in water, that tend to kind of clump up or ball up when placed in water. So not so soluble in water. And I'm being a little bit careful with my words. I didn't say outright hydrophobic. There are definitely lipids that are outright hydrophobic, but there are also some lipids that have some end of their molecule that's hydrophobic, but then other parts of the molecule actually might be hydrophilic. And there's actually words for that. So you have some lipids that are just straight out hydrophobic. They literally try to avoid the water. They're non-polar molecules, so they just clump together. But then there are some that have hydrophobic parts and hydrophilic parts. And these are called, and I always have trouble saying this word, amphipathic molecules, where some part is hydrophilic and some part is hydrophobic. And we're going to see that in a few seconds when we look at phospholipids, which are crucial for the structure of cell membranes. And we're going to see that a lot when you go into biology. So what are all these other molecules? And let's think about what parts of them might be hydrophobic and what parts might be hydrophilic. When you look at fats, you have this long hydrocarbon chain. There aren't any obvious charges over here. In fact, there aren't any, oxygen is more electronegative, so you might have a little bit of a partial negative or partial positive charge, a partial negative at the oxygen, or maybe a partial positive end at the carbon. But carbon is still more electronegative than, say, hydrogen. So you're not going to be able to form the type of polar bonds that, hydrogen bonds you would if you had hydroxyl groups here, if this was an alcohol. And these hydrocarbon chains over here, these are very hydrophobic. So that's what makes fat not be so soluble in water and clump up when you put it in water. This molecule right over here, which we would classify as an ester, and that's because we have an ester group. We have an ester functional group right over here, where you have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and then single bonded to another oxygen, and then that oxygen is bonded to a long hydrocarbon chain, and that carbon is bonded to a long hydrocarbon chain right over there. This is clearly going to be hydrophobic. And this particular molecule that we're looking at right over here, this is a major constituent of beeswax. Beeswax. And if you've ever dealt with beeswax, or really any type of wax, and waxes in general are considered to be lipids, you can see that they're not soluble in water. In fact, they're often used to repel water, to keep water from penetrating into something. So wax, and in particular beeswax, and beeswax isn't made up of only this molecule. This is one of the main constituents. It has other molecules mixed in there, but this is also a lipid. Now, what's this thing over here? This thing, I have one 6-carbon ring, another 6-carbon. Whoops! I have another 6-carbon ring, another 6-carbon ring, and then I have a 5-carbon ring. This is the telltale sign. And let me circle these 4 rings right over here. These rings are the telltale signs that we are looking at a steroid. And in popular culture, steroids have, if you think of steroids as something that bodybuilders might inject illegally to pump up their muscles. But steroids are actually, when you think about it in chemical terms, they're actually referring to things that have these molecules that have this general structure, where they have this 6-carbon ring, this 6-carbon ring, another 6-carbon ring in this orientation, and then another 5-carbon ring. And this steroid that we're looking at, this has an OH group attached to it, so it's actually going to be an alcohol. So a steroid that's an alcohol you would call a sterol. Sterol. And this particular sterol is one that you've actually dealt with a lot, or at least you've heard about. This is cholesterol. So this one in particular is cholesterol. And cholesterol is often viewed as a negative thing. You know, people want to lower their cholesterol, but it's essential for life. It's essential to the functioning of your cells, and it is a precursor molecule for your steroid hormones, which make you you. And this right over here is a steroid hormone. It's a very well-known one. This is testosterone. Testosterone. And you see the telltale, you have a 6-carbon ring right over here, another 6-carbon ring right over here. The double bond is in a different place than cholesterol. Here you have a double bond right over there. Then you have another 6-carbon ring, and then you have the 5-carbon ring. And instead of an OH group here, you have a double bond, you have a carbonyl group, you have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, but it actually does still have an OH group up here. But this is a derivative of cholesterol. This is a testosterone. It is a steroid hormone. This is another steroid hormone. This is cortisol. Cortisol also can be derived from cholesterol. And you see the telltale signs. You see the 6-carbon ring. This has a double bond right over there. You see another 6-carbon ring. 6-carbon ring like this. It's actually hard to see the double bond, so I just won't even refer to them. I'll just refer to the general shape. So you have a 6-carbon ring there, 6-carbon ring there, 6-carbon ring there, and then 5-carbon, whoops, and then a 5-carbon ring just like that. So once again, they all have this steroid-based structure, but then they also have other parts that make them different. For example, that is different than that is different than that. And just so you can visualize these things in 3 dimensions, in an actual molecule, they're not going to look exactly like this. And even talk about what something at an atomic scale looks like is kind of strange because light behaves in weird ways. But you can imagine the molecule would look like this if this is kind of a ball and stick model. Well, here you're thinking about what it actually might look like in space, where the white balls are hydrogen, the gray ones are carbon, and the red ones are oxygen. So this is also, this right over here is what a cortisol molecule would look like if you're thinking in kind of a space-filling visualization. Now, I talked about amphipathic molecules, and phospholipids are probably the most well-known example of it. And phospholipids, they have a lot in common with triglycerides, in that you have this 3-carbon backbone right over here. 3-carbon backbone. Let me do that in a different color. So you have a 3-carbon backbone right over here. So this is a carbon, that's a carbon, that's a carbon there. Each of them are attached to oxygen, so you can imagine that this could have been derived from glycerol. And then 2 of the carbons, like in a triglyceride, are bound to a fatty acid like this. But then one of the carbons, the 3rd carbon, instead of being bound to a fatty acid like you have in a triglyceride, is bounded to a phosphate group. So this right over here is a phosphate group, and this R could just be another chain, another organic chain, so to speak. But when we talked about amphipathic molecules, I always have to say it slowly, so it's a bit of a tongue twister for me. We're talking about having a hydrophobic end and a hydrophilic end. Well, what's the hydrophobic end here? Well, this chains from the fatty acids, especially the hydrocarbon chains right over here, these are going to be hydrophobic. Hydrophobic. While the phosphate end right over here, it has charge. Charged molecules dissolve in water very, very well. And so this one over here is going to be hydrophilic. It's going to be, I guess you could say it's going to be attracted to water. And that's why phospholipids, and this is just one type of phospholipids, these chains could be different. We have a unsaturated chain here, and then a fatty acid chain, and then we have a saturated fatty acid chain on the left. And this is just, I actually just made up this molecule, and they could be different depending on the phospholipid you're talking about. But this general property of having a hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails make them very well suited for cellular membranes. Because you can imagine, so that end is hydrophilic, and then you have these hydrophobic hydrophobic tails. And actually, let me see if I can copy and paste this really fast. I actually can just draw it really fast. So let me just draw a bunch of them. Whoops. Nope. I'm having trouble. All right, let me just switch back to my drawing tool. So let me just draw a bunch of the hydrophilic heads, and then a bunch of the hydrophobic, whoops, actually I'll draw a few more hydrophilic heads out here, and then I'll draw all the hydrophobic tails. Hydrophobic tails. Let me draw them really fast. I'm almost done right over here. Hydrophobic tails right over here. And this configuration that I've just drawn, where you have a bilayer of phospholipid, a phospholipid bilayer, this is how cellular membranes are constructed. Because this, you have water, or things that are very water-based, inside the cell. This could be inside the cell, and this could be outside. This is outside the cell. And so the phosphate ends is attracted to the water, and then but the hydrophobic, the hydrocarbon tails, those are going to they're going to orient themselves in this way to get away from the water, really to just let the phosphate ends interact with the water. And so this forms a nice boundary for the cell, and we're going to study that thoroughly as we go more into biology. So hopefully this gives you more appreciation of what a lipid is and the different types of lipids.